I'm Thomas. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Thomas Strand. I'm a professor of law in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program here, and the director of the 2040 initiative. And I'm just going to do a brief introduction. I was actually thinking back that one of the first community events that the 2040 initiative did back in the fall of 2014 was we did a conversation on race with Jamel Bowie from Slate Magazine, who was here. And we did, our purpose all along has been to talk about challenging issues. This is kind of where the negotiation and conflict resolution part comes in. Talk about challenging issues in a way that kind of opens up the space. And so, kind of pulling forward from that conversation about race, we're kind of coming at it from a different place today. And I'm really thrilled that we've got three panelists, three white men witnessing race, white guys witnessing race, and Kathy Gonzalez. Let me just briefly introduce them, and then I'm going to step out of the way, and Kathy is going to moderate. So Tom Lenz is a professor in our pharmacy school, and he's the head of the wellness program here, the degree in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies in the graduate school. Correct me if I get anything wrong. And our lead with the Highlander program over at 75 North. Guy McHendry is an assistant professor in communications whose work focuses on surveillance, and he's going to talk a little bit about that. And then Greg O'Meara, who is a professor of law and also the rector of the Jesuit community here at Creighton. And Greg was actually in the first, this is our fourth Speaking Truths event of the year. Greg was actually in our first one as well. And Dr. Kathy Gonzalez, who is a faculty member in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution program, who is going to be the moderator, and I'm going to hand my mic over to her. Thank you so much for being here.
So welcome everyone. I'm just going to give you just a brief outline of what the format for this afternoon's program is going to look like. Each speaker is going to speak for no more than 5 minutes, just to orient themselves in this topic. And then we're going to open up the floor for questions, comments, and have some healthy debate. At about 1:45, we're going to do an interactive exercise that I really hope you enjoy and that really leaves you with a good sense of what we spoke about and maybe what we can look at going forward. So with no further ado, I will hand it over to our first speaker.
Oh, apparently it's me. That no more than 5 minutes is a suggestion. I'd like to begin with a theorist who I'm fond of, Julia Kristeva, who teaches psychology. She's a student of Lacan's at the Sorbonne, and in her book, Strangers to Ourselves, she writes, "In the fascinated rejection that the foreigner arouses in us, there is a share of uncanny strangeness in the sense of the depersonalization that Freud discovered in him, and which takes up again our infantile desires and fears of the other of death, the other of woman, the other of uncontrollable pride. The foreigner is within us, and when we flee from or struggle against the foreigner, we're fighting our unconscious. Delicately, analytically, Freud does not speak of foreigners. He teaches us how to detect foreignness in ourselves." My background is in law, and I graduated from law school. I worked as a prosecutor in a very segregated city for a total of 6 years. In the middle of it, I went back and taught law school at the University of Wisconsin. But I spent a lot of time working with white police officers, sometimes black police officers, bringing in overwhelmingly men of color. And frequently, the way crime works, it's black on black crime. And so a lot of my work was trying to work with victims of crime, humanize them for juries, humanize them for judges, and try and bridge wherever that gap was. Then I entered the Jesuits, had a number of interesting little places where we worked. At one point in my first kind of assignment as I was doing graduate work in philosophy at Chicago, I was a chaplain for gang members in Chicago housing projects. Rockwell Gardens, Dearborn Homes, and primarily Cabrini Green, where we accompanied guys. And one of the issues I dealt with that was fascinating to me was sitting one afternoon outside of the Henry Horner homes with a guy who was probably in his early 30s, and he said, "Greg, I'm the oldest black man I know. Everyone else is either in prison or dead." And so the theological way I would start thinking about that was through a theology of suffering and also through a theology of liberation. How do we talk about resurrection for these people? And it goes really and truly theologically through the cross, through the idea that these are human beings who suffer. And for a whole lot of different reasons that came up. As a teacher, I experience my life through the lives of some of my students, and I find students of color who are under-invited to speak in class, or who sit there as faculty members say racist or sexist or offensive things. And their achievement is undervalued. I belong to an international Jesuit community, and one of the things that I have is, as Jesuit brothers, I have a lot of my Jesuit brothers are men of color, right? African American, South Asian, Asian, African, Latin American, and I see the world and what happens to them within the Jesuit community, what happens to them in the greater world. And as their superior, I celebrate them with them their victories, and I deal with them with their sorrows. Last point I'm going to make, since I'm hitting time, is I'm also disturbed to find an unconscious racism in myself that takes place this way. Grading in law school is done by random generated numbers. I don't know who they are when I grade exams and papers. And I always go through a terror that I'm failing an African American student. I never have. They actually do me at the top of my class, but I'm always worried about it. And it's a fascinating moment to sit and say, I try to be really open-minded, but I apparently still worry about over or undercompensating, and that, you know, someone is dealing with not being able to be as top of the game academically, which they are, but I still fear that they're not. And that's an interesting thing for me.
So this panel is weird and interesting for me because on the one hand, there is a tendency to almost always invite white men to speak on panels. There's a wonderful thread on Twitter and Tumblr of pictures of all white male panels. Yes. And so actively contributing to and taking part of that is a fascinating way of challenging it and simultaneously being part of the problem. And that's a line that in my teaching and research, I find that I have to walk a lot. When I teach gender and we talk about feminism and patriarchy, I'm the white dude in the front of the room telling often mostly women about what feminism is, and that's the exact point, right? That's the problem. So I just want to acknowledge some of the structure here of how we got to be here as part of our inherited privilege, and I hope that that comes up more and more. For me, thinking about where race intersects with my life, it is fundamentally personal and intellectual, it is academic, and it is familial. When I was very young, my family sponsored a student who came over from another country. Elaine was from Haiti. She lived with us while she studied. I consider her to be a friend and a sister. And when I was in my early teens, when she first arrived, my family was at the grocery store doing shopping, and we ran into some family friends, and after we had walked away, but still within earshot, our small talk didn't explain why Elaine was there, and I could hear them say something to the effect of, I didn't know that the McHendrys could afford a maid. And there was this assumption that this person with us who looked different than us was there to serve and work for us, as opposed to be here, to be in school, to be part of our family, and to be an equal within and part of our family. So that was something that I carried with me. When I arrived as a freshman in college, my roommate was from Mississippi. He was a very tall black man. I was a very short white man. We were a very wonderful pair together. And I, over the course of that year, would often ask or say or invite him to do things that I didn't know could possibly be problematic for him. Not just places to walk or go where he would be followed or exposed to increased surveillance, but little things like the process for him to get a haircut and the process for me to get a haircut are very different when you're in a rural town of 7,000 people. And so I started to see how our lives went on very different paths for reasons that were about race and nothing else. We had the same major, we were at the same college, our families and family structures were very similar, and yet I had privileges that he could not take. And so I've tried in my research as I study about surveillance to carry with me some of the ways that race makes a difference. I hear when I'm teaching those differences come out in how students respond to things. Earlier this semester, I was talking about diverse family structures and how structural issues create families that we think of as non-normative. And the topic of families and slavery came up. And a student who was well-meaning and very bright described the relationships between a slave owner and a female slave as a romantic relationship. A student of color described it as rape. And that distance between those two descriptions is one that is about race, and that as an educator I have a responsibility to point out, to notice, to facilitate, and draw our attention to that conversation. In a couple weeks in that class, we're getting ready to read a book called Black Girl Dangerous, and the difference of how students respond to challenges to privilege, to what it means to be an ally when it comes from an author who is white and shares primarily their worldview, compared to this book where the author is not and challenges them and us and me and their vision or version of white feminism, is phenomenally different, and it comes from calling students to see race and to learn that and internalize that myself, even though I live in a social structure where it's very easy for me to ignore the power or the impact of race.
So when I was invited to do this, I actually got very nervous. I don't get nervous speaking in front of people, but because that's what we do, for a job. But I got kind of nervous because here's my context. I grew up in a small rural town in Iowa, and I'm just going to ballpark is about 99% Catholic and 99% German. And so as in like 99.999, there's probably not enough nines, just white people. And so that was my context growing up. And I remember at one point in my junior high school years, there was a family of color that moved into town. And the big buzz before they came, because it was a big deal, was that they had a boy that would be my age. And the thing was, I think he's good at basketball. I mean, that was like the conversation. It was really, you know, for me, I guess at the time, maybe I didn't think anything of it. I have certainly people close to me, as in relatives, that would make, you know, comments that were not, you know, appropriate, or racial comments not appropriate. And it never, those things were always challenging for me, you know, growing up in this context. As I then came here to Creighton, those comments continued to follow. So what's it like, you know, going to school in an inner city and having, you know, diversity, racial diversity that way, and those things were, I think I became sensitive to that at a very early age, because it always, to some level, bothered me. So then, when I'm invited to speak, you know, in front of people about this topic, I get nervous, because I think to some degree, you know, at many times, maybe even overcompensate, feeling some level of empathy for racial issues that I don't want to be part of. And as a white guy, a privileged white guy from Creighton as a professor, I'm very sensitive to that. So now I'm put in this position of, we have a very special project going on in North Omaha in the Highlander project. And so this was something that I was invited to be part of and to lead about 3 years ago. And so my first reaction to that was, you know, where we need to be in what we're doing there is to be present. For Creighton to be present in North Omaha, because of, it's not an us versus them. It's not a, you know, a street divide of things. We need to be, we're neighbors, and we need to be with each other in many ways. So over a course of the 3-year period, I've met with many groups of people, individual people, to try to get a sense of how can we work together. It's not a rescue mission that's going on there, but truly a partnership in the correct context there. And so one thing that was really interesting, my wake-up call was at it was just a one-on-one meeting with someone who lives in the community. And she said to me, she was a woman of color. She said, I didn't say anything explicit, but she said, why are you apologizing for being a white guy? And I didn't say it, you know, but I was obviously coming across as being apologetic for having privilege and being, so I am obviously very sensitive to this, and unknowingly so. And I think it was from the context as my, you know, early days of growing up in an environment where I heard a lot of racial, and then as I got to, you know, further along into this point, realizing that, you know, this is different for me than perhaps some other people, but very uncomfortable with the position that I'm in as a white guy, you know, experiencing race.
Thank you.
Here's the.
Well, I don't think I need this, but. So what are we going to do now? What I want you to do now is just, you know, take like 10 seconds and think about the perspectives presented by each panelist. And then I want to hear from you in terms of your reactions to what they said, to the feelings that they described, and maybe what that evoked in you as you sat here listening to what they brought to this conversation. So I'm going to invite you to share, and it's just that it's an invitation. So please don't feel pressured in any way. So who wants to go first? No pressure.
I just was thinking, I was just thinking, listening,
Yeah.
just listening to them that we don't have enough white guys like them, was my thought. That think like them, that feel the same, that have compassion for minorities.
Thank you.
I was listening, and on one hand, I was, very happy and very impressed to hear people to have been so thoughtful, excuse me, at various points in their lives about how they interact with race, how race may interact with them, recognizing privilege, all of those things. But at the same time, I thought about it coming from the perspective as a man, with a lot of similarities in background, in, advanced degrees, working at the same place, all of those things. The one difference is that I don't have moments. My entire existence in the United States of America, from waking up to going to sleep to while I'm asleep, 24/7, because of the way our structures are put together, it's somewhere in your mind. So it's just a difference. Like, on one hand, much appreciation, but on the other hand, it just made me think of my experience, that it's not, you could pick any single thing that's happened in my life, and if I pick it apart enough, because it's happened in the United States, my racial identity probably would be woven in there somewhere.
Thank you.
I have a comment.
Certainly.
So I was sitting back here thinking that when the invite got sent out, there was a link sitting there, an article from National Geographic, and I read the article. And so I'm listening to your comments. Thank you all for sharing your comments. But I was sitting there thinking, these are probably not the white men that I'm worried about in terms of in the context of the article, and thinking just where we are as a society, whether you're looking at what's going on in Congress, it seems like there's no civility, and the protests that have been out. And so I'm wondering what, from the panelists, from your perspectives, when there's maybe other white men or white people that may feel threatened by the changing demographics, how do you approach that to try and get them to be less concerned?
Thank you.
So my area is rhetoric. So I'm very concerned with what we say and how we say it. And I think, so I shared some of the ways in which I had experiences that showed me the disparity around race, and that created moments for consciousness raising. And I do want to echo and acknowledge Dr. Witt's response, because I get to choose when I see it. And that's a privilege. But I also think about how things could have been very different. So my aunt and my grandparents, they've passed now, lived in Florida, and I would go visit them quite a bit. They were the first people who I ever heard use the N-word. It was not a one-off, it was frequent, it was part of their vernacular. And you said, like, these are not the white men I'm worried about, but my family is in many ways still comprised of folks who are explicitly racist, even while denying it, and in various ways vote for or encourage or support structures of violence that impact people of color. And I think that one of the things that we have to do, and this is going to be like really broad, but the difference between someone who has lived, worked, or spent time in close proximity with a person of color versus someone who has not makes a significant difference in their approach to diversity. And we are regressing. Our cities are already segregated as a legacy of redlining, and a number of other structural factors. And in many places, we are resegregating our schools quite intentionally, right? Forming new districts to keep students of color out. And so at a structural level, we have to find ways to encourage folks who do not look like one another to live with each other. And we have to stop putting that obligation on people of color to leave their communities, right, as we boxed people of color in. And so I'm very worried about that and the role that rising racial animus plays in reinforcing those boundaries.
Yeah, I think I would add, I've had very similar experiences because I have family members who, at the same time, have said, you know, very racially strong opinions and words that way, and some of my family members are very close to me that way, and I don't think they really even know that they're even saying it consciously. But and so what I have done recently is invited them to come with me to the Highlander, just come over here and experience what's going on. And I think part of it is exposure to the rest of the world, right? And not the world that is in the little box that is the world that these folks live in, but broaden things. I don't know quite how to answer the question, honestly, because it's the same folks who support all of the stuff that's going on in Washington that isn't right also. So that's the challenging part, and for me to put the boxing gloves on and, you know, let's just go. Right now is not my style, but I really want to, you know, and I know that that's not the right end. But so I don't know what the right answer is. I struggle, honestly, with that, on what to say and how to do it. It's only the experience, just come experience.
I do want to add one thing, because I mean, we're at a university, and I think education is so vitally important. And not just education like as an abstract concept, but having schools that are well-funded and have materials. And then I'm a faculty member. I exercise enormous amounts of power over what I ask my students to read. And if my syllabi are primarily white authors talking about issues from the perspective of white bodies, I am failing my students. And so we need to think about curriculum, we need to think about K-12 curriculum, college curriculum, and whose voices are represented and supported. And when we fail to do that, and often, not to throw my colleagues under the bus, but we do fail to do that. And that makes a tremendous difference for even just getting a student to think beyond their experience for once.
I'm really happy to throw my colleagues under the bus. I have no problem with that at all. So what I begin to do is I have to give my students an alternative and correct narrative. So I point out, for example, something you people may not know. I teach criminal law. Violent crime in this country has been going down since 1993. Violent crime has become significantly whiter. The majority of violent crime in this country right now is committed by white males. At the same time, our prisons have gotten predominantly blacker. And I smile at my students and say, now this is from a wildly liberal organization called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This leftist communist group has gotten together to manufacture this fake news. How are we going to fight it? And I want them to have, because you always put, challenging stuff in the mouth of people who are really, they're going to see how this goes on. And then I constantly give them folks who are pointing this out, and at the same time what we have done is cut welfare benefits. By how much? Right now, what used to be aid to family with dependent children is now called temporary assistance to needy family, is now in real dollars 60 to 70% less than it was in the 1970s. So poor people are getting a lot poorer and getting a lot less. What we have done is we have shifted from having any kind of safety net at all to what is hyper-incarceration. And unless my students understand that as part of their criminal procedure or criminal law courses, then if they just see what they're doing as sort of bloodlessly applying precedent, they have to understand what's the sociological reality we're looking at. And we fail as an academic institution if our students don't know that, and that there are real flesh and blood bodies on the line.
Can I make one more comment? So I guess it was last semester, a student in my class was a black gentleman from North Omaha, and we were talking about the disparities in food insecurity was the topic, and how that relates to the larger context of living in poverty and how race is involved. And so I asked him before class, do you mind educating everyone in this room from a peer-to-peer standpoint on what it was like to grow up in North Omaha relative to these things we're talking about? And it was really a fantastic, I think, experience for the students who were in there. And I was really grateful for him to be able to be open on how he talked about growing up and the issues he had to deal with relative to race. That the other folks in the class had no context. You know, we don't have a very racially diverse campus, and so the opportunities to do that are not that great for our students, and I was really grateful for that one to do it. So that was, I think, helpful for all the males and females in there.
Thank you. So there's a common thread revolving around structure. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'd like to think about what are the existing continuing structures that cause us to be seated here today having this conversation in 2018. Let's just reflect on that a little bit in terms of maybe even bringing it back home to Creighton. Are there structures that exist here? And if there are, how perhaps can we approach them? Because we don't want to be having this conversation in the next 50 years, I'm assuming. So if we could think a little bit about the structures that perpetuate. And I want to hear from you with respect to that. What are your thoughts around that?
Hi, I arrived late, so I apologize. I'm Cindy Costanzo, and I'm the chair, department chair, in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. And I'm so happy that you raised this. I'm happy that you're having this forum and this discussion. I was recently able to go to a leadership development for women in higher ed called the HERS Institute. And most of the sessions over the last 6 months have really involved inclusivity, excellence and inclusivity. It was a wonderful opportunity for someone like myself who hasn't had that opportunity to have really engaged, deep discussions. And we had a wonderful woman from the Dominican University who's the Chief Diversity Officer. And I want to bring her here to campus. But we had this discussion about, so what can you, a white woman or a white male of any privilege, do in a structure where most, which is at Creighton University, is white. And what I loved about this, because you do feel like a little powerless, like, what can I do? But in that discussion, we were reminded that we have places at tables where where there's no diversity. It's all white around the table. And you need to use your privilege at that time to bring that awareness to the fold. And to be silent is against, well, for me, it kind of like empowered me, like, oh my gosh, I've been way too silent. So that was so simple but so important. And we can all do that. Thinking task force that you're on, committees that you're on, hiring committees that you're on. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And I'm an administrator. I'm a senior associate dean in the graduate school. I have lots of opportunity. And so I've been exercising that voice finally. I'm 62 years old. Let's get going here, Costanzo. But very important. And raising awareness, because we're blinded because of that. So anyway, that for structure, that's so important to make sure that we raise that voice and do what we can from our table. So. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a faculty member at the School of Law and have been an administrator here and elsewhere previously in higher ed. And one of the dynamics, when we talk about structure, that occurred to me that I've seen play out both institutions. And this came up with my colleague, Professor O'Mara, talking about, and I think actually Professor McHendry talking about this too, faculty who challenge students to see different perspectives. And I've seen more than once instances where faculty members do that around race and privilege, and there's a backlash. There'll be a backlash to the professor, which will then come to the administration. The administration is then either petitioned or in some way pressured to let the professor know that what they're doing is inappropriate, that they should be studying law. We need to be, well, because law presumably exists in a vacuum where there are no races, he says ironically. And then and what I started to see, because as I was thinking this through, again as an academic and hopefully a person that recognizes the dignity of all, is that there are other perspectives that are being taught routinely in a law school class without question. So the faculty member that talks about law and economics and uses that to offer a view of efficiency as important, as appropriate, no backlash. A faculty member who brings in their religious background and either explicitly or implicitly speaks about the inappropriateness or immorality of a certain sexual orientation, no backlash. Or if there's a backlash, it is one that is awfully quiet and ignored. And so when that's pointed out, then the conversation is, well, this is different, this is indoctrination, I'm being told how to think. And what occurred to me was, you know, in addition to the societal factors that are there, oftentimes that instructor is vulnerable because there's no visible, official, institutionalized commitment to that being an appropriate conversation.
Yes.
And until that happens, faculty members will continue to be vulnerable in addressing those conversations. They'll be vulnerable either in their reviews, by student evaluations, they'll be vulnerable in their tenure process, or they'll be vulnerable in the academic community in which they're situated. So again, I don't know how to articulate that structure, but I've now seen this dynamic play out at multiple institutions, and there's something in there where the institution itself has not identified that, is not willing to stand behind it, accept the consequences that are standing behind it as appropriate as a priority.
Thank you.
So I'm reading a book by Bell Hooks, and he talked about rhetoric, and she talked about unlearning the social construct of race and racism. So I'm wondering, why is this, and nobody's mentioned it yet, why is this not named white men witnessing white supremacy?
Want to comment before I take this?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Hello, my name is Curtis Fisher. I'm a mailman around here. I wish people could walk in my shoes. I see a lot of things around here, and I have to explain to a lot of folks on various behavior levels of why this is happening. And people say to me a lot of times, well, what is your economic background? What do you have to contribute to this system here? I said, well, I work here. I walk into many, many areas where there are behaviors that go on, and I have to look the other way. And it's shocking. Everybody's seen Undercover Boss. Someone needs to walk with me one day just to experience my world. And I go home a lot of times and I say, it's just part of my day, not to take it serious, and go on.
Thank you.
Oh, no, that's it.
Does anybody want to address the issue of why the name of the panel? Why it's not white men witnessing white supremacy?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I didn't name the panel, so I don't know the rationality, but I will say, just a few months ago now, I had the pleasure and honor to edit a special issue of the Journal on white supremacy in the age of Trump. And we had that explicit conversation, and I pushed in the reviews those authors to name not just instances of white privilege or excuse attitudes or perspectives because of lack of exposure. And I worry about that a little when I say things like, well, you know, if people just had more diverse experiences, it would be better, like they're helpless, right, amid all these structures, because they're not. So I do think the point is well taken, and that a lot of the things that we contribute to, that we witness, that we look the other way on, are not just us witnessing race, but are us witnessing and supporting white supremacy. And so I think it is important to affirm and acknowledge that that belongs very seriously in this conversation, and especially when we start thinking about structures, which are the means by which white supremacy is carried out. So issues around housing, environment, school funding, mass incarceration, policing, wages, leisure time, all of those things implicate systems of oppression, and they're white. It is white supremacy.
And there are a lot of things that are coded for white supremacy that we think of as bloodless, and the market, efficiency. Well, you know, if the market decides, right, meaning if you have a bunch of white guys who are in charge, they're going to pick more white guys who look like them to hold jobs. And then they also don't want to pay health insurance for people who get a little older. So if you've got a choice between, you know, someone in their 20s who's relatively healthy and someone who's in their 50s, still relatively healthy, at some point they're going to get sicker faster, it's going to cost me more. So, you know, leaving things up to the market actually codes in a whole bunch of inequalities. And so we have to actually be willing to say, you know, the invisible hand of the market is not the visible hand of God. But to say that out loud is a level of heresy far worse than anything else Father O'Mara has said in the past couple of years here.
So I just want to add one thing to that, because in my surveillance class we talk about structural factors that create situations where marginalized folks experience disparate impacts of surveillance. And when we talk about redlining either in its origins or how it has structured our segregated cities today, right? So Cumming Street was literally a red line on the map, segregating who could live where. I often have students respond to the modern day problem by saying, well, I just don't understand why banks would still discriminate on race, because that's market inefficiency. And market inefficiency is something that is bad and that the market solves, but it doesn't. And so I think calling and pushing us to remember that these things are our social constructs and they do not have agency. We have agency. We determine how they are implemented is important. And so we have to challenge this idea that these are forces beyond our or human control, and there's some creation of God or nature, because they're not.
Okay, so there were two comments, one from Paula and one from the lady at the back, and then we're going to go into that interactive exercise that I spoke to you about. So quick comments.
Yeah, you had just asked about structures, and so I just thought it was really interesting how, obviously red line maps have come up a lot, but the way that we talk about, North Omaha, or even you had mentioned communities in Chicago, I can count the number of times I've been to Chicago, but I knew immediately when you were talking about those neighborhoods, and I know that's one of those monumental tasks, but we have to find a way to push the borders out a little bit, or somehow help people expand, because if we're going to keep just your thoughts, I grew up in a community very similar to yours where we just didn't have, people that weren't white that lived around us, And so it just seems like there has to be a way to break the structures and to move them out, because right now, we're trying to deal with things within it. Like we've got a project in North Omaha, and you almost say, well, say no more, we understand it's gotta be one of these types of projects. And so that occurred to me when you said structures, is we know they exist, but how do we break them, or, open it up so that we don't perpetuate it and, make it a thing unto itself?
You can skip me.
Okay.
I'm gonna come out of my skin if I don't get to say this.
Okay.
I'm an outsider, I don't know, I'm not of Creighton, but and I don't know who's in this room, but I certainly hope someone will take you up on your offer. I think that's brilliant, the undercover boss, and spend a day and bridge the gap. I imagine your day plays out very differently than those of a professor or an administrator.
Oh, it's really interesting. What I walk into and experience sometimes, it's like, go to your happy place. I see a lot of times.
Well, I hope there's someone in the room that will brainstorm with you and maybe make that come to fruition.
Okay, so we've heard a lot to digest, a lot to think about, a lot to, just ponder upon. So what I want you to do now is find a partner, because bringing out this topic outside of this room is going to be difficult. So I want you to find a partner. You can just be the person next to you. And I want you to start that conversation by asking this person, what brought you here? Why did you come? And then you're gonna exchange, because I want you to leave here with a tool, something that you can do as you exit this room, to at least start having these conversations about structures, inherited, continued, or otherwise, about what somebody else's day might look like, about what we can do to change those structures. But it has to start from somewhere. And the NCR program's mission is to create agents of change who can engage and resolve conflict efficiently, effectively, and humanely. So I think that if we start at that point, we begin to open pathways. So we're going to take like 2 minutes each, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what that felt like. You heard nothing? I guess. Nothing at all?
Okay, I don't belong to Creighton at all, so I'm just somebody from the outside, a little bit like the lady over there. But I felt frustration, and I felt like in order to change a system, the immensity of what that means. And yes, you try to go by the, what did you call it, the lines of a protocol, I guess is what we would call it. But sometimes you can't do that. But before one does that, they would need to have a great support. Because going against the lines of protocol, you can get squashed. Especially if you're a lone speaker. But if there is a great enough urgency for something that can be done, there could be a large enough support group that you can go beyond the lines of protocol and you would be heard. Anyway, that would be my hope.
Okay, so we have a hopeful note that momentum would help us address some of those structural issues.
I have a comment to comments like that where we don't have the institution backing us up, or if there were enough people. My comment to that is be the person that steps out of the line. Be the person that teaches those students even if you're not gonna be backed up. And if you're not backed up, then go to an institution or go to another group that will back you up. I have a huge problem with that, where I can't do anything and I can't stick up for anybody that's a minority because I don't have anybody backing me up. Be the first person to take the step and do it, is my comment.
Hi, so I'm Jackie Font, and I am the program director of the NCR. And for me, I've been here 11 years, and as a woman from Puerto Rico who has stepped up, there is a price to pay. And what I do is I remind myself every single day of my intentionality of choosing to stay here to change that. But there is a huge price to pay, and I think you always need to have that north. And the one thing that has kept me here is that there's wonderful students. There's also a great group of people really looking forward to fight it. And so it's the intentionality of making that choice to stay, even though it has a price to pay. And so to your point, I think, the fact that things like what you were describing happen, the fact that we can pack up our bags and leave somewhere else, and that's always an option, and it should be considered, but being able to make that decision to say, yes, there will be a price to pay, but I see that glimmer of hope and the people that are on site trying to make changes, and that is worth supporting.
Oh, and I commend you for taking that. Take my cue.
Sure. I've already put my foot in it, yeah.
Just checking.
I agree with that, and I am untenured, and I have made that choice to include subject matter in all my classes and to say things repeatedly, but when I discuss issues with students when they come to me or other faculty, I will say one of the things that is a impediment, and I don't know how we change it unless we all work on it together, is that there is a sort of there's been such a normalization of tolerance of shockingly openly racist statements in classes in front of students over time that seems to have no consequence whatsoever. And so I've heard repeatedly students who come to me to tell me about it say, we're totally othered. It won't matter if we tell anybody. Nothing will happen. It didn't matter last year, it won't matter this year. And I think something has to give. And I was prepared for, which is a terrible thing to say on some levels, but I've been in academia a while now. I was prepared for misogyny. I wasn't prepared for the level of racism.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time together. I hope that what you heard will stay with you as we leave this room, because clearly they're very important steps that we need to take to address some of the things that have been identified here. Please stay tuned for further NCR programs as we try to navigate these conversations and perhaps move them to action. I want to thank you for coming. Please complete the evaluation forms that are on the desks in front of you, because they really help to guide and shape future programs. One last comment.
Well, for those of you who don't know, I'm Christopher Witt. I'm the new Vice Provost for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. And I really appreciate being here. I appreciate the openness that everybody has. And it's going to take a while. These first weeks I've been on a listening tour going around the campus, and I'm sure the first few years of being here will be a listening tour. But I certainly want to hear your perspectives. Oh, yeah. So find me, or I'll find you, but it's probably easier to find me since it's one of me. But please find me, and even if it takes us weeks, if it takes months for us to find a time to link up, I certainly want to hear from folks, because that really helps me in finding the direction, prioritizing what we need to do, figuring out what types of teams I need to put together. So thank you for just giving me a second to throw that plug out there.
No problem. So, thank you again, folks. And you can hand me your evaluation forms. Okay, so we hope to see you again. Thank you very much.